At 2:15 in the morning, on the 16th of December 1811, the town of New Madrid was asleep. It was a small river town on the western bank of the Mississippi. Around 1,000 people lived there. Most were farmers, hunters, fur traders, or boatmen moving goods between St. Louis and New Orleans. Life was simple, quiet. Most homes were one-story log cabins or wooden houses. There were no tall buildings, no warning systems. No one had any reason to think the ground beneath them was dangerous. Then, people heard something. At first, it sounded like thunder far away, but it didn't fade. It grew louder, deeper, more violent. A few seconds later, the ground started moving. Not shaking in one place, moving. Floors rolled under people's feet. Walls cracked. Furniture slid across rooms. Outside, large trees snapped and crashed in the darkness. Livestock panicked. Horses pulled against their ropes. Cattle cried out. Dogs barked and ran with nowhere to go. Then, the air changed. A thick haze settled over the town. It smelled sharp and strange, almost like sulfur. Visibility dropped so badly that people could barely see a few feet in front of them. The darkness felt heavier than normal. The noise made it worse. People could hear branches breaking, cabins creaking, animals screaming, and somewhere beyond all of that came another sound. The Mississippi was roaring, not the normal sound of fast water. This was louder, wilder. Like the river itself had been torn open. People ran outside, but the ground kept shifting beneath them. Some fell. Others held onto trees or fences just to stay upright. When the first violent shaking finally eased, many thought it was over. It wasn't. Another jolt came, then another. By sunrise, witnesses had counted dozens of separate shocks. Houses no longer felt safe. Families dragged blankets and supplies outside and slept in tents, sheds, or whatever shelter they could build. They waited for the ground to settle. But through the next day, the next week, and the cold nights that followed, the rumbling kept coming. That was when the people of New Madrid understood something terrifying. The first earthquake had not been the disaster. It was only the beginning. 3 months after the first earthquake, a woman named Eliza Bryan wrote down what she remembered. She had been in New Madrid that night. Her account described the noise, the darkness, the falling trees, and the strange smell in the air. But one detail stood out more than everything else. She said the Mississippi River changed direction. For a short time, the current moved backward. That statement was hard for people to accept. The Mississippi was not a small creek. It was one of the largest and strongest rivers in North America. The idea that an earthquake could force it to reverse sounded impossible. So for decades, people dismissed her story. They said she had been terrified, confused. Maybe she saw waves moving in the wrong direction and misunderstood what was happening. And honestly, from their point of view, that explanation probably felt reasonable. There were no cameras, no modern instruments, no detailed maps of the faults beneath the river. All they had was the memory of a woman who had been standing in total darkness while the ground moved under her feet. But Eliza was not the only person who saw something strange. Riverboat crews reported violent changes in the current. Water surged in unexpected directions. Boats were pushed around. Temporary waterfalls appeared where the riverbed had shifted. Still, the story of the river running backward was treated like a frontier legend. For more than a century, the accepted view was simple. A river that large does not reverse. Then scientists began studying the land beneath New Madrid. They found buried faults. They found evidence that parts of the riverbed had risen, while other areas dropped. Suddenly, Eliza's account no longer sounded impossible. It sounded precise. She had described a real physical event long before science had the tools to explain it. So the question is not whether a frightened woman imagined something in the dark. The real question is this: did Eliza Bryan get it wrong? Or did the science of her time simply fail to understand what was hiding beneath the Mississippi? By sunrise, the people of New Madrid had already felt 27 separate shocks. And the ground still wasn't done. Most families stopped sleeping inside their homes. The cabins were still standing, but no one trusted them anymore. Every creak sounded like the next collapse. So people moved outside. They built tents, lean-tos, and rough shelters from blankets, wood, and whatever they could find. Winter nights were cold, but sleeping in the open felt safer than being trapped under a roof. For days, the earth kept trembling. Sometimes it was a hard jolt that sent people running. Other times, it was a low rumble beneath their feet, just enough to remind them that the danger was still there. They waited for it to stop. It didn't. Then, on the 23rd of January 1812, the second major earthquake hit. It came from a different part of the fault system and spread damage across a huge area. By then, many survivors were already living outdoors. That may have saved lives. A tent can shake, but it cannot crush you the way a collapsing house can. After that second quake, the region grew quieter. Not completely quiet. Small tremors still came and went. But compared to the weeks before, it felt calm. People started to believe the worst was over. Some returned to what was left of their homes. Travelers came back through the area. Riverboat crews slowly returned to the docks. Life did not feel normal, but it started to feel possible again. That brief calm was dangerous. It gave people hope before the ground had finished with them, because 2 weeks later, before dawn on February 7th, the third earthquake struck. It was the largest one yet. And this time, it would not only shake the land, it would change the Mississippi River itself. To understand why New Madrid could produce earthquakes this large, you have to look far below the Mississippi. Buried under layers of mud, sand, and rock is an ancient scar called the Reelfoot Rift. It formed hundreds of millions of years ago when the land that would become North America started pulling apart. For a while, the continent was beginning to split. A deep crack opened through the crust. The ground stretched. A rift valley started to form. Then the process stopped. The continent never broke in two. From the surface, the damage slowly disappeared. Rivers carried in sediment. New layers of earth covered the old fracture. But underground, the crust never fully healed. Think of it like a crack in a piece of metal. You can cover it. You can paint over it. It may look solid again, but the weak point is still there. That is what sits beneath New Madrid. For millions of years, pressure has continued to move through that damaged zone. Most of the time, nothing happens that people can feel. Then, enough stress builds up, and the old fault slips again. That is what makes New Madrid so strange. Most major earthquakes happen near the edges of tectonic plates. California has the San Andreas. Japan sits where several plates meet. The Andes formed along another active boundary. New Madrid is nowhere near a place like that. It sits deep inside the North American continent, in a region that looks stable and quiet. That is the part people struggle with. The ground there does not look dangerous. There are no obvious fault lines cutting across the surface. No mountains marking a plate boundary. Just towns, farms, highways, and the Mississippi River. But 2 miles below them is a wound from an ancient attempt to tear the continent apart. It closed on the surface. Down below, it never really did. Not everyone ran from the disaster. A few people stayed calm enough to watch, write, and measure what was happening. One of them was John Bradbury. He was traveling on the Mississippi near the mouth of the Ohio River when the first major earthquake struck. Bradbury was a naturalist. He was trained to notice details, and that night, he saw things no one had ever described before. The riverbanks started collapsing on both sides. Huge sections of soil broke loose and crashed into the water. Trees, roots, and entire pieces of the bluff were swallowed by the river. Each collapse pushed out a wave. Some were strong enough to nearly sink Bradbury's boat. The river filled with debris. Logs spun in the current. Mud and broken trees moved through the channel. In places where the riverbed had shifted, temporary waterfalls appeared. The Mississippi no longer looked like a river people knew. It looked unstable, violent, almost alive. Farther upstream in Louisville, another man was recording the earthquakes in a different way. His name was Jared Brooks. Brooks built a set of simple pendulums by hand. Each one had a different length, so each reacted to a different kind of ground movement. It was basic equipment, but it worked. For the next 4 months, Brooks kept careful records. By the time the shaking finally slowed, his pendulums had detected 1,874 separate earthquakes. That number matters. Without Bradbury's written account and Brooks's homemade instruments, much of what happened might have been dismissed as rumor. Science did not yet have modern seismographs, satellites, or underground imaging. The tools were not there, so the record survived because ordinary people paid attention. They wrote down what they saw, they measured what they could, and they preserved evidence that scientists would not fully understand until more than a century later. Sometimes history is saved that way, not by advanced technology, but by someone who refuses to look away. In the months before the earthquakes, a bright comet appeared over North America. People could see it for much of 1811. In Europe, it became known as Napoleon's Comet. In parts of North America, some native communities connected it to Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, who was traveling across the region at the time. Later, stories grew around the comet, Tecumseh, and the earthquakes. But the important part is not whether the comet was a warning. The real story is about memory. For many American settlers, the New Madrid earthquakes felt completely impossible. Most had arrived in the region only a few decades earlier. They had no written history of major earthquakes in the central United States. To them, this was something new. Many native communities saw it differently. Their oral histories carried memories of older earthquakes in the same region. Those stories had been passed down through families and communities for generations. Modern researchers have since found evidence of earlier major earthquake sequences around the years 900 and 1450. That means the land had done this before. The settlers simply did not know it. So, when the ground started moving in 1811, two groups were looking at the same disaster with very different backgrounds. One believed the impossible was happening for the first time. The other already carried stories of the ground shaking, the land breaking, and the rivers changing. That does not make every old story a scientific record, but it does remind us of something important. A place can lose its history when the people arriving there do not know what happened before them. The danger was never new. Only the people standing above it were. At 3:45 in the morning on the 7th of February 1812, the third major earthquake struck. This one was different. It was stronger than the first two. And it broke along the Reelfoot Fault, a buried fault that crosses the Mississippi River. Deep underground, one side of the fault was forced upward. In just a few seconds, part of the riverbed rose. In some places, the ground lifted by as much as 15 feet. On the opposite side, sections of land dropped. That sudden movement changed everything. The raised riverbed acted like a temporary wall across the Mississippi. The river was still carrying an enormous amount of water south, but now, part of its path was blocked. The water slammed into the new rise and began piling up. There was nowhere for it to go. Pressure built quickly. The surface became violent. Waves pushed through the channel. Boats were thrown around, and men on the river watched the current lose its normal direction. Then the water upstream began moving backward, not just in circles, not just from waves bouncing off the banks. The current itself reversed. For several hours, the Mississippi flowed north against the direction it had followed for generations. Imagine seeing that in the dark. These boatmen knew the river better than most people knew the roads around their own homes. They knew every bend, every fast current, and every dangerous snag. But nothing in their experience prepared them for a river running the wrong way. At the same time, the land on the eastern side of the river was sinking. A new basin opened, and water rushed into places that had been dry ground only minutes earlier. Eventually, the temporary blockage gave way. The Mississippi returned to its normal southward flow, but it was no longer the same river. The channel had shifted, new sandbars appeared, old landmarks were gone, parts of the shoreline had collapsed, and the land beside the river had been permanently changed. For more than a century, people treated Eliza Bryan's account as fear and confusion. They said she must have misunderstood what she saw. She didn't. Eliza had recorded the direct result of a fault lifting the riverbed. The science needed more than 100 years to map what was hidden below. She had already described what it did. As the land dropped beside the Mississippi, river water rushed into the new basin. Within hours, a lake began to form. What had been swamp and forest was now filling with water. The land sank faster than anything living there could escape. This became Reelfoot Lake. It stretched for miles across what is now northwest Tennessee. But the strangest part was not the size of the lake. It was the forest inside it. The cypress trees were not knocked down by the earthquake. They did not snap or wash away. They stayed exactly where they had grown. Then the water rose around them. Their roots disappeared first. Then the lower trunks. The trees slowly drowned while still standing upright. That is what makes the scene so unsettling. A fallen forest looks like destruction. This one looked almost normal at first. The trees were still there. They just could not survive in the new world that formed around them. More than 2 centuries later, many of those dead trunks are still visible above the water. They rise from the lake like markers, not monuments built by people, evidence left by the land itself. Visitors can still move through the shallow water and see the remains of trees that were alive before the earthquake struck. They are a direct link to that morning in 1812. The river eventually returned to its usual direction. The shaking slowed. People moved away and rebuilt their lives somewhere else. But Reelfoot Lake never disappeared. Neither did the drowned forest. The landscape kept the damage long after the people who witnessed it were gone. And every tree still standing in that water tells the same story. The earthquake did not just shake the land. It created a place that had never existed before. By the time the shaking began to slow, New Madrid was barely a town anymore. Homes were damaged or gone. Riverbanks had collapsed. Roads and familiar landmarks had disappeared. In many places, the land itself was no longer usable. The earthquakes forced water and sand up through cracks in the ground. Thick layers of sand spread across fields that people had farmed for years. Other areas suffered from liquefaction. The soil lost its strength and started acting more like wet mud. Buildings sank. Ground split apart. Fields that once supported crops could no longer be trusted. Families had already spent months sleeping outside. Now, many had nothing left to return to. Some communities packed up and moved west. Others left the river completely. For the people who stayed, rebuilding was not just about replacing a cabin. The land beneath them had changed. By 1814, William Clark, the governor of the Missouri Territory, asked Congress to help the survivors. Clark was the same man who had crossed the American West with Meriwether Lewis years earlier. He understood the size of the region and how hard it would be for these families to recover on their own. Congress approved the request in 1815. The federal government set aside $50,000 in disaster relief for the people of New Madrid County. At the time, that was something new. There was no regular federal disaster system, no modern emergency agency, no standard process for declaring a disaster and sending help. New Madrid helped create that precedent. The earthquake did more than destroy a town. It forced the United States government to accept a new idea. When a disaster is too large for one community to survive alone, the country may have to step in. So when will New Madrid produce another major earthquake? The honest answer is simple: no one knows. The geological record shows that this region has been hit by large earthquake sequences before. Researchers have found buried sand deposits and damaged soil layers linked to older events around the years 900 and 1450. That tells us the 18111812 earthquakes were not a one-time accident. The fault system has become active before, then gone quiet for centuries. But modern measurements have made the picture more complicated. Since the 1990s, scientists have used GPS instruments to track tiny movements in the ground around New Madrid. Those readings suggest the crust may be building strain more slowly than some earlier models expected. Some researchers see that as a sign the fault may be quieter than the geological record makes it seem. Others disagree. They argue that a few decades of GPS data cannot outweigh centuries of physical evidence buried in the ground. A fault can look quiet for a long time and still produce a major event. That is where the debate stands. The old evidence says powerful earthquakes have returned more than once. The newer measurements suggest the pressure may be building slowly. Both can be true, and neither gives us a date. There is no reliable countdown. No year scientists can circle on a calendar. Anyone claiming to know the exact time is guessing. What we do know is that the fault still exists. It has not disappeared. It has not been proven harmless. So the real question is not whether someone can predict the morning it happens. The question is whether the region will be ready if it does. The next New Madrid earthquake would not strike the quiet frontier of 1812. It would hit a crowded, connected part of modern America. Millions of people now live inside the wider impact zone. Cities like Memphis, St. Louis, Little Rock, and Evansville sit close enough to face serious damage. Memphis is especially vulnerable. Much of the city was built on soft sediment left by the Mississippi River. That kind of ground can make shaking feel much stronger than it would on solid rock. And the problem is not just where people live. Thousands of older buildings were built before modern earthquake codes. That includes homes, apartment buildings, churches, hospitals, and office towers. Then there are the bridges. Interstate 40 and Interstate 55 cross the seismic zone. These are major routes for people, food, fuel, and freight. Memphis is also home to one of the most important shipping and logistics hubs in the country. If roads, bridges, airports, or power systems failed at the same time, the effects would spread far beyond the earthquake zone. That is what makes the risk different today. In 1812, the land was dangerous, but the population was small. There were no major highways, airports, high-rise buildings, or national supply chains running through the region. Now, all of those things are sitting above the same fault system. The next earthquake does not have to be stronger than the one in 1812. Modern society only has to be more exposed. And it is. The drowned cypress trees are still standing in Reelfoot Lake. They have been dead for more than 2 centuries, but they are still there. Quiet proof of the morning the ground dropped and the Mississippi changed direction. People can forget a disaster after a few generations. The ground does not. The fault that created the lake is still below the region. The old rift is still there. And the cities above it keep getting larger. The real lesson is not that anyone knows the exact year another major earthquake will happen. No one does. The lesson is what happens when people know a danger exists and still act as if it is gone. In 1812, the people of New Madrid had no idea what was beneath them. Today, we do. A natural event becomes a disaster when the risk is known, but the preparation never catches up. Follow the channel as we uncover more forgotten disasters that changed entire landscapes and then slowly disappeared from public memory.